Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including 2 nights of poetry on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, and Kristen Bear in conversation with Virginia Pye on Thursday. You can get more information and register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, Mercy House. A reminder to please keep your audio and video turned off. Any questions can be sent to me via chat, and I will relay as many to Alena and Alison after the presentation as possible. We are very excited to welcome Alena and Alison, and I want to tell you a little bit about them, and then I will turn the event over to them. Alena Dillon is the author of Mercy House, which is in development as a CBS All Access television series produced by Amy Schumer. Her work has appeared in publications including LitHub, River Teeth, Slice Magazine, The Rumpus, and Bustle. She has a new novel coming out in April, The Happiest Girl in the World, about a young woman's dream of Olympic gold and what it takes to reach the top. Alena teaches creative writing and lives on the North Shore of Boston with her husband, son, and little black lab. Alison McGhee is the author of a number of books for adults, young adults, and kids. Her best-selling novel, Shadow Baby, was a Today Show Book Club pick, and her picture book for adults, Someday, was a #1 New York Times bestseller. Her most recent book, The Opposite, The Opposite of Fate, is about the way a young woman reconfigures her life in the aftermath of an assault. She is the recipient of many fellowships and awards and has 3 grown children and lives in Minnesota and California. And on that note, I'm going to turn my camera and microphone off and turn the event over to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. And thank you everyone in the room. I'm just going to call it a room for coming out tonight. I am so excited to be talking with Alena, whom I just met a few minutes ago, about her novel Mercy House. I loved this book. I am a slow reader, which is kind of a curse for a writer. And so for the couple weeks it took me to read the book, it was like my treat after writing, my treat after running, my treat that I could return to. Mercy House, I'm not going to give away any spoilers here, but I'll just give you a little bit of overview before I ask Alena the questions I'm dying to hear her talk about. Mercy House is the name of an old row house in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn, where a nun, a fierce and funny and indomitable older nun named Sister Evelyn, has founded a home for girls and women who have been abused, whose lives have been broken by the men who have taken advantage of them and manipulated them, in some cases at threat for their very lives, their physical lives, and their spirits and bodies need healing. And so long ago, Sister Evelyn founded the home that she called Mercy House, which is a safe haven for the women on the streets. There's an angel on the doorknob, and that's how women on the doorknob or over the house door. And that's how women know that this is a place they can go day or night, and they will find shelter and solace and protection. And the book is narrated in the voice of Evelyn for the most part, but also some of the girls and women who live in the home. As we move on in the book, we find that Evelyn herself was designated to be a nun by her Catholic family, particularly her father, when she was just a child. And so it always felt like her destiny. But when she was, I'm not Catholic, so I'm just going to say nun in training, I'm not sure, a novitiate maybe, when she was studying to be a nun in the convent, she experienced an horrific kind of abuse at the hands of an older priest. Mercy House takes a big twist early on when the nuns who run it find out that Bishop Hawkins is coming to do his best to shut down the place. And this has particular significance to Evelyn, who carries the same sort of trauma within her as the girls and women who seek shelter in Mercy House do. So it's a page turner of a book. It's part mystery, although it is set before the very current times of Me Too. Everything in this book is part and parcel of what we live with, what women have always lived with, and what we are now rebelling against. Not that we haven't always, but all the issues that Evelyn is facing in her own life and that the women and girls of Mercy House are facing are the same issues that are in the headlines and have been for the last few years. So, Alena, is it okay if I ask you a few questions about the book?
Yes, please. And thank you so much for those kind words. You spoke about it with such love and generosity. I want to take you to all my events.
That works for me. So Mercy House is really a fabulous read in many ways. I was not raised Catholic, and I'm a Unitarian Universalist, if that gives you some idea of me. But as a non-Catholic who my whole life has been deeply involved with men raised in devoutly Irish Catholic households, I have had a fascination with the church, and fascination both good and bad for much of my life. And so I am deeply intrigued and interested in your depiction of the nuns, especially the nuns who are in charge of Mercy House. Can you tell us a little bit about your own experience, if you have any, with Catholicism, Catholic school, nuns, and how you came to create such vivid characters in the nuns who are in charge of Mercy House?
Yeah, thank you. So I was not raised Catholic either. I was raised Episcopalian, but we were deeply involved in the church. I went to the church probably 3 or 4 days a week for different reasons: choir practice, youth group, Sunday service. So I'm very familiar with feeling at home in a church, and how, which Sister Evelyn, that was her practice as well, growing up and feeling like it was a second home, and the comfort of the sanctuary. And so I had a context for that. My dad's family was Catholic, so that provided more context, and my husband's family is Catholic. So I was surrounded by it in a way, but mostly when I started working at St. Joseph's College in 2010, was my first introduction to nuns in particular. So I had arrived there with kind of this preconceived notion that nuns are, kind of upright and pious and uninteresting, and was immediately shocked to find how complicated and hilarious they can be, and of course they are, because they're human. But I had this misconception. So I realized quickly, that they're competitive with one another, and they were jealous, and they had secret stashes of chocolate in their desk drawers. And the first holiday party, I watched them dance to It's Raining Men. But they were, so in addition to being complicated and human, they were also so superhuman. They were in their 50s and 60s, 70s, and even 80s, and still working long hours in high-ranking positions at the college, never saying no to any favors, so committed to the students, running around doing as much work as they could as quickly as they could. And then when I would go home and put on my sweatpants and watch Netflix, they would go and pick up an extra shift at night. So either, sleeping over at a women's shelter or at the mother house. So that was my exposure to nuns. And while I was there was during this apostolic visitation, which was this nationwide investigation of American nuns conducted by Pope Benedict at the time and Cardinal Rodet, who suspected that nuns in general were operating under a feminist ideology and were too secular and promoting social justice values over Catholic doctrine, and wanted to visit every order to make sure that they were falling in line, and operating as they wanted to. And these nuns that I worked with would kind of gather and exchange intel about what they had heard, what their fears were, what they thought the Vatican was after, what the repercussions might be. They didn't really trust the material that they were given. They kind of suspected there was a bit more and that the Vatican wasn't being transparent. And they were scared. I mean, they were, a lot of them were senior citizens who have no savings of their own. They've dedicated their entire life to this institution, which means that they are paid salaries by the college, but their salaries are donated to the church, so they don't get to keep any of it, and then they're paid a stipend. Which goes directly to, to shelter and foods. They had no savings. They'd have nowhere to live, no health insurance. So if the Vatican was coming to kind of cull out, what they consider to be bad apples, these women were in very tenuous situations, and they'd have nothing to fall back on, no security. So that was kind of that's the world, that's the setting of Mercy House, but it wasn't exactly what I had set out to write about. When I left in 2015 to move to Massachusetts, where I am now, I just missed being around that spirit of women, this like can-do attitude where they would, tackle everything themselves, and they were living under restrictions. There were a lot of rules and things that they couldn't do on their own. Like, for instance, if they were approaching, a holiday. They couldn't, operate the services themselves. They had to now call a priest and ask about his schedule. And so they were like, they ran this whole college, but then like there'd be certain details where they were at the whims of men. But they would work around it, and this was just their life. This was just what they dealt with and what they were used to. So I missed that sisterhood. So I started writing about what would call a woman to such a radical sacrifice of her life and such commitment. And as I was researching, like all sorts of autobiographies and different things about nuns in general, I kept coming over this investigation. And the more I learned and the more I was endeared to nuns, the more outraged I became on their behalf. Because the very institution that should have been advocating for them the most and should have been so proud of them and should have loved them was kind of, putting them under the spotlight, and at the same time protecting the men in their ranks who should have been weeded out, who had committed very egregious crimes. So that's the more I researched, the more I started reading firsthand material that the Vatican was issuing, third media parties, little chat rooms that nuns were having with each other online. And so this kind of world was really intriguing to me. Like, how would these women feel being investigated, especially if they had something to hide? So that's kind of that was the launching pad for this story.
Oh, that's so interesting to me. Your last comments there made me remember a book I read last year, Snowflower and the Secret Fan by Lisa C. Have you?
Oh, I know Lisa C, but I don't think I've read that one.
Well, it's set in, hundreds of years ago in China, where women would communicate with their own secret handwriting that they would lightly trace onto the fans that went back and forth between their homes. They were not allowed to read and write, of course. And so it seems you're reminding me that women have always had ways of subverting the power that would subdue them. Yeah. And that's one of the themes that just runs through the whole novel of Mercy House. And it's something that I loved about it, because as a feminist, as a woman, as someone who rebels against being told what to do and how to do it, the novel really spoke to me. And I think that's one of its great strengths. You also reminded me of how scared of nuns I always was, based on all the stories that my Catholic friends would tell me. They always seem to involve rulers and knuckles. And I just grew up with a lot of them. And a couple of years ago, I was at a book awards ceremony with my boyfriend, raised deeply Catholic. And there was a young nun there. And I, of course, would never have spoken to her because of this kind of fear and preconception of what a nun is, but he walked right up to her and said, "Hey, sister, how are you?" And she and I ended up having the most incredible conversation. It just went on and on. She was fascinating. She was getting an award for having started a sort of homeless youth outreach program. She told me where she lived, which was in, a tiny apartment that she shared with a bunch of other nuns, and how on summer nights she would go up on the roof and sleep alone, and how much she loved that because, she looked at me and she said, I'm a nun. I don't get a lot of time to myself. So you just made me remember that conversation.
Yeah, like your mention of what she was winning the award for is just like what I kept coming across for with nuns is like that is their calling. Like they were the first feminists, like they were the women years ago, before the 60s, before there were options. If they didn't want a traditional life inside the house, the convent was kind of where they went. And yeah, like social justice seems to be their priority, and they're always the ones kind of spearheading these initiatives in the Catholic Church. And yeah, but I also have heard plenty of people that read my book and say these are not the nuns that I grew up with. So like there's there's plenty of good and bad, I think, in every profession, including nuns. But my dad grew up in parochial school, and he was acquainted with the knuckle smackers that that you mentioned. But yeah, I think that there is this like maybe because they had that they had the habit that kind of drew a blankness over them. There is this like notion of them as being kind of frigid individuals, and that was just not my experience. Yeah, and not what I came across with in research. There's this awesome group of nuns called Nuns on the Bus, and they just tour the country all year, a few years ago, with this campaign of just like political awareness, and like they would pick a different issue every year and tour on the bus and raise awareness for it. So yeah, they're ingenuitive and brave, and scrappy because they have so little to work with.
Yeah, so little. You've already touched on it, but one of the main themes of the book is abuse, of girls, of women, of nuns by powerful men who are given yet more power in a fundamentally sexist society and church. And you mentioned that you were raised Episcopalian and then you began teaching at St. Joe's, but did you draw from any more personal experience about abuse? How was your understanding of that particular kind of abuse shaped? And did you intend to write about it in Mercy House, or was it something that sort of evolved as you were writing? Every writer writes differently. Some people know the entire story and they just write it out. Other people, and I'm one of them, sort of go where the story takes us. And I'm interested in the origin story of that theme of abuse.
So I've tried to write in every single way, and and haven't found a one that works for me yet, as an easy shortcut anyway. But so the abuse, I think, originated from my research, because that was one of the things that struck me as I learned more about nuns, is how many reported being abused. It was 25% was nuns reported experiencing sexual assault, which is very similar to the stat across the board for all women, but which I thought would be a safe. I just thought the church would be a safer environment, but apparently not. And there had been some horrific cases, like especially the one that still horrifies me is and that I mentioned in the book, is a case of an African village and that had an HIV epidemic. Yeah, and there was 26 pregnant nuns simultaneously, because the priests turned from the women in the village to the church, because it was a safer environment. So it was stories like that that made it seem like a relevant component to incorporate into the house, that and a realistic one, and one I had to capture, but also because the main character of Evelyn is inspired by a nun from St. Joseph's College, in spirit and physical appearance. I didn't know her that well, but she had a very vibrant presence at the college. She was the provost at the time. So she was up and down the halls. And there was kind of this story that was told about her because she did the overnight shift at women's shelters after her shift as the provost. And whenever someone would come and knock on the door, she would groan and reluctantly get out of bed to help them. And that's struck me as such a human reaction, but such an unexpected one from a nun. So that became the opening scene from the book. So this women's shelter that she slept over in Brooklyn was called Providence House. So I didn't want to stay too close to reality, so I altered it a bit. The Providence House is more geared toward women who are coming out of prison and giving them a safe place to transition along with their children. And Mercy House is more for a refuge for women who have suffered assault and abuse. But I started writing this in 2015, which was the rise of the Me Too movement. So I think that was a huge influential, and you mentioned that in your very generous opening. That was a huge influential movement for many reasons, but also for the building of this story, particularly because as I was researching, I kept seeing this parallel between all these Hollywood men that actresses were coming out and talking about, and nuns, surprisingly, because they're both inside these institutions where men in power are holding women hostage in some way, whether like in Hollywood, it was their careers. They felt that their careers were on the line, and so they couldn't come out and badmouth them because they were holding that over their head. And then with the Vatican, it was these nuns' livelihood, as well as their reputation and their commitment to God. So it's these kind of worlds in which men have women at their mercy, basically. And what was kind of fascinating and horrifying about nuns in particular is that they've taken this vow of obedience and this vow of silence, especially before the switch to Vatican II. So there were just so many elements impeding the truth from coming out and impeding justice from being served. So it's kind of this kind of pressure cooker that just spawned these bad experiences.
Okay, wow. It's as if the book was born at the crux of Me Too, hundreds of years of abuse of nuns, international stories, and it's really the perfect time. The book's timing is perfect. You know, I want to ask you, the house itself, the old row house in Bed-Stuy, that is the refuge, Mercy House, it's almost like a character in itself. It's old, it's creaky, it's got the stairs, it's got the big kitchen. I felt as though I were sort of living in the house as I read the book. And I'm wondering where that particular house came from. You know, do you have experience? What experiences of your own came to bear on the setting that you put the book in?
So I relied heavily on Google Maps. So I wanted it to be in Bed-Stuy in particular because the mother house of the St. Joseph women is in Clinton Hill, which is in kind of like a posher, cleaner area. And I wanted Mercy House to be kind of in an area of Brooklyn adjacent to that hadn't yet been gentrified in 2010 and would still kind of serve the population. I was born in Queens, and my entire extended family still lives in Queens. So I kind of have a feeling of a New York suburb. But in addition to that, I wanted to be pretty accurate. So I knew I wanted it to be in Bed-Stuy. And so I just kind of I was in Massachusetts at the time. So I dragged and dropped my little man in Google Map until I found a street that I thought would work that was kind of near Ralph Avenue, which is like this busy kind of intersection. And so I found Chauncey Street, and I was just walking up and down and, virtually, which is what we're all doing these days, and looking and until I found the home that I wanted. And then, so my grandparents, I'm trying to think, because the house feels so real to me too. And I'm like, have I been in this house before? But I mean, maybe it's just because, I've just spent so much time there. I don't know how you feel with when you're building settings. Do you base them on real places, or do you build them in your mind and then they just feel like real places?
I would say both.
Yeah.
It's most of my adult books are set in the foothills of the Adirondacks where I grew up, and the house I grew up in plays a big part, just little pieces of it. But sometimes even just on a road trip, driving down a certain block of a small town, I'll just get an idea based on a building there. So, it's an impression that builds itself into a world, or it's a world based on one that I know well. So I
Right.
think both ways for me.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back on like almost every house like of a character. I feel like I know it so intimately, but I can't place that I've been there before. So I don't. Yeah, maybe you take little pieces, like you said, little impressions, and then just let it kind of blossom. But yeah, Mercy House. I loved how they made the cover of the book the front door, so that like when you open it, it's almost like the reader is entering the house. And then you have the stories of all the different women that are residing there, so it's like the book itself becomes the house. So that was, yeah, that was a cool kind of connection.
You know, the themes and experiences of the women who seek shelter in Mercy House, and the experiences of many of the nuns, are so painful, just so filled with grief and trauma. And yet the novel is not at all like that. The novel is full of brightness and humor. Evelyn is hilarious, and some of the girls are hilarious. And so it's a combination of trauma and pain, generationally speaking, for many of these women and the nuns. And it also is about the power of goodness, and determination and redemption. I felt as though there were just currents of hope that run throughout the entire novel. The nuns of Mercy House, with virtually no support from their church or from anyone, have created this oasis of healing in the middle of pain, in the middle of a painful neighborhood. And it feels, in a way, by their refusal to give up, by their very existence in the world and their refusal to give up on hope, that they radiate this compassion, which creates its own, what's the word? This own kind of energy, that propels both the home, the women who live there, and their mission forward. And so I would love it if you could give us a little bit about your own mindset in writing a book that is equal parts pain and hope and redemption. It's not an easy task to do that, and I think you did it masterfully. So,
Oh, thank you. I think I'm really drawn to people, to resilience in general. We were before the event, you had mentioned Trevor Noah's memoir about his like the experiences that he endured, traumatic experiences, and how like I marvel at his current energy and positivity and humor. So yeah, it's that kind of resilience that I admire so much. So, and also I think I just, I have to be hopeful. I mean, that applies now. It's been hard this year, especially to like look around and look at everything that we've endured, and to continue to be hopeful. But I don't know how you go forward any other way. Like, how do you not just stand still if you think that it can't get better? So, but then these nuns in particular, I think, kind of generate that feeling because they have so much working against them. so many obstacles to work around, and but they don't just stagnate, they don't just give up. There's just all these workarounds that they do, if, even if it's under the table or, yeah. So I think just being able to write about their world, kind of lent itself to one and ingenuity, and redemption, because that's what they're committed to. So yeah, I think it's a mix of needing to be hopeful to survive those kinds of experiences, and just kind of feeding off of the women that I met, and how they face their obstacles.
That brings me to something else that I really appreciated about the book, which is you mentioned that you opened the book with Sister Evelyn, who is in her late 60s, sort of moaning and groaning and feeling every ache and pain of her tired body as she gets up in the middle of the night to answer the doorbell. And there's a subtle theme throughout the book of our physical bodies, both the natural effects of aging and how they influence our way of being in the world, but also about the stories that we hold within our bodies. The girls and women who are seeking shelter at Mercy House are holding stories of trauma almost locked within their muscles and bones. And one of the nuns in the house performs what I think of as energy work. She tries to draw the stories, she tries to draw that pain and resolve that trauma within the women, and they appreciate it. And this is something that has always fascinated me, the idea of every experience that we have ever had in our lives is held within our bodies somewhere. At least I believe that. And can be drawn out, and the way we physically exist in the world can influence our minds and our hearts and our understanding of past trauma. And I just wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that.
I would love to. And first, though, I have to address the same topic in The Opposite of Fate, which is Alison's novel. It did this so beautifully. Yes. So very briefly, it's about a girl who was assaulted, and in the assault suffers a brain injury that puts her into a coma. But and then she wakes up and wakes up to the consequences of what happened to her, and has to be told what she endured. And but part of so there's this question of, even though she wasn't awake for the injury, does it now to the abuse, does it now exist in her body? Does she hold that trauma in her body as she goes forward? And she's a massage therapist who did the very thing that you're talking about, which was working at a women's shelter, actually. So it was so all these books have such overlap. So she worked at a women's shelter, and as every person that would sit down and lie down on her table, she would kind of discover their stories, their injuries through their energies, and try to draw them out of them. And you described that so beautifully. And I love getting massages, and I was just thinking about it, and how what incredible brave work that is, to know that you're going to be facing all of this darkness, but that you're serving in this way. So if anybody hasn't read that book, it was just a gorgeous and compelling, and and fast paced. It was so fast paced, and has a lot of overlapping themes to Mercy House. But anyway, so back to bodies in Mercy House. Yeah, I thought about that a lot. So Evelyn's assault had occurred so many years earlier. But it was obviously completely unresolved because she never faced it. And a lot of her life choices, because she never faced it and never even forgave herself for having experienced it, because she blamed herself for it, were tarnished as a result, or at least influenced as a result. Who she blamed in her life for putting her in that situation, and the grudges she held because she was forced to endure that pain. Where she dedicated her life services, opening Mercy House and wanting to help these women. So the trajectory of her life was completely shifted because of this assault. And she's very hard on her body in general as a critic. Like there's a scene where she's taking a bath and kind of surveying her body, and she's not fair to herself or not loving to herself. And that's, I think, all of a result of having endured this and internalizing it, and blaming herself for it. And then, and thinking her body went unserved because it wasn't able to kind of perform the natural traits that women do, never getting to bear a child, never getting to breastfeed. There's a lot of discussion of physicality and the merits of it, and the consequences of pain and time. Yeah.
I loved Evelyn, and I was so pleased at the end, I will not give anything away, to see that there may be a new kind of happiness in her life. And I always like to imagine within myself little future scenarios for the people in my book. What do you think? How do you think Evelyn is doing right now?
Yeah, so I've been asked that question a lot, like would there be a sequel, or what would I had mentioned that in the CBS pitch for the adaptation, they talked about a possible second season, which of course is very exciting. But in a lot of ways, I don't want Evelyn to have to undergo enough conflict to constitute a whole nother plot. Like I feel like she's done her time. She's harbored, 60 years of pain, and she just got over it. Like the ending, I was like, some people say they didn't think it was resolved enough, but like I felt, and maybe it's because of exactly what you said, that you kind of imagine what happens, at least the feeling of what happens beyond the book. I was kind of sending off Evelyn in my mind to now, like, she's learned to love herself and to love others freely. And she made this whole journey, and now she's, she should be able to go off into the sunset and do whatever she wants to do, with a clean conscience and a bright future, even though, she's 70 years old now, but, she's going to enjoy the time she has, which could still be, 30 years. So yes, I hope that Evelyn enjoys the rest of her life, but if a season 2 comes along, her happiness may be derailed.
Oh, I feel like the book ended just perfectly. I felt it was resolved in just the way I like things to be resolved, which means not everything is tied up in a neat knot, but her perseverance and determination against the forces of evil in her life, and embodied in this Bishop Hawkins, I felt that, she was just in my heart, and I thought exactly as you did, honey, you go have some fun now.
Yeah. It's so hard to do endings because some people like it really nice and tight just for their own satisfaction, but then it's like, it's just not, it's not an accurate capturing of what life is. So yeah, I always like the saying, and I forget where I heard it, but endings should be surprising in the moment, but inevitable in retrospect, so like that, like so it has like a nice kind of, it's not what the reader was expecting necessarily, but as you look back to what led you there, it's exactly where it should be.
Yeah, I completely agree. I always tell my students, you want it to feel inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of a little pivot or a surprise or a resolution, however tiny, is just right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
right.
That's why I like the ending of Mercy House.
Thank you. I also liked the ending of The Opposite of Fate. It had that kind of similar like harmony, right? Like like a reunion type feel, and like so we can see where people are going. It's like you send them off in the right direction, but you don't bring them to the end. It's like just Start on your way.
It was funny how similar in fundamental ways our books are, because it was serendipity that kind of brought us
I
together.
know.
So,
I couldn't believe it as I was listening to your book, and I was like, I was loving it so much. And then, yeah, and also it takes place near Utica, which is where my husband grew up, which is a funny thing. Yeah.
wow, that's amazing. That
Yeah,
is,
there was so many there. It was not the opposite of fate, I guess.
no, I guess not. Well, what do you think? Are there any questions from the room? I don't want to hog the stage. If people have things, if you've read the book or if you haven't, Alena
Well,
could.
while
do-
people are drumming up questions, I have a question for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You must have had to do a lot of research about like the science of brain trauma and coma, right? Like how did you come across that as a plot element?
It stemmed from my greatest fear when my kids were little, that it was a recurring nightmare I had, that I was in an accident or somehow ended up in an unconscious state for many years and woke up to see these three vaguely familiar looking adults, young adults, looking down at me in a hospital bed. And I realized that I had missed their entire childhoods.
Oh my
And
gosh, that is
yeah,
terrifying.
I still have that dream, even though they're all in their 20s now. So, they made it, I made it. But yeah. And I think that came from my childhood terror at the story of Rip Van Winkle, which is
Which is
supposed to
an
be this.
upstate New York thing.
Yes. Well, it's supposedly a happy story. He wakes up and he goes back to his life. And all I could think was he missed 20 years of his life.
I know. That's what I was thinking of with this reunion that happens at the end of Mercy House. It's bittersweet because they get back together, but they squander, and with Evelyn holding a grudge with her family, all the years you squander, it's such a loss. I mean, you don't want to lose any more time, but my goodness, it's like the time's gone by already.
Yeah, and time goes by anyway. And so, we can't waste it. And when it's forcibly taken from you by an assault and a state of unconsciousness, then, oh, it's very painful. It was a hard book to write. Yeah.
Do you find that you write a lot out of fear? Like you think like you're kind of tortured by certain things and you kind of deal with it on the page?
I have the same themes over and over, and they're all almost all related to life goes by, and it goes
Yeah.
by so fast. And how do you reconfigure your life and your sense of self in the wake of the things that life throws at you? There are so many things that happen to all of us that we would not have chosen, and yet here you are. And how do you reclaim your sense of self and move on and make stake your claim on your own life? And that, I think, is one of the things I responded to so strongly in Mercy House. This terrible, terrible thing happened to Evelyn and to almost all the women featured in the book. And yet here they are, they have claimed their lives. They have not moved on, but they have absorbed and transfigured the experiences of pain that came to them unwanted, and are living lives of determination and purpose and love and laughter. And that's what I so admire. I so admire that about human beings, and maybe women in particular. So
Yeah. Yeah, I forget what author I heard say this, but I think that's a common occurrence, is that you write the same book over and over again, really, but it's like at the core, it's the same book, but it's just, played out with different characters and different plots, but it boils down to the same essential oils.
same essential oils, exactly.
Yeah. So we have a question. What are you both reading now? What are you reading, Alison?
Oh gosh. I just started. This is such a strange year and strange time, and somehow I need a book that I don't know what I need. And so the last 3 days I picked up books and started them and put them down. Today I picked up a book I bought a few years ago called Italian Shoes by Henning Mankell. And it's so far about an older man who lives alone on an island off the coast of Sweden. And I'm transfixed by it. I'm about 20 pages in. I'm transfixed by it. So that's the novel I'm reading. And I'm also slowly and beautifully making my way through a new book of poems, Bonfire Opera by Danusha Lamaris, who's one of my favorite poets. And so poetry is my big thing. I read poems every day, and I like to read books of poetry very slowly, a couple of poems a day to let them settle in. So I'm going back and forth when I'm not doom scrolling through the New York Times.
Yeah,
How about you?
I know what you mean about picking up books and then putting them down. I mean, in general, I feel like I do that. Like, I think maybe like the stress and anxiety of these days occupies so much of our brain that there's just a small percentage left. And so you have to really have something that speaks to that percentage so that you're not distracted and that you're keeping engaged to it. I just finished today because I listen to a lot of audiobooks now that I have a 1.5-year-old son. So I split my time with my husband on work and childcare. And so I feel like I'm very limited. So I read when I can, but I have to read on the go a lot to keep up with my habit. So I just finished The Good Neighborhood by Therese Ann Fowler. It was so beautiful and tragic, and so engaging. Like, this was a book where, like, at the end of the day, that's the thing with audiobooks is like I read them on the go. So like I'm running or I'm cooking dinner or I'm chasing my son around. And then at the end of the night, like I wanted to keep going. So I was just like sitting on the couch listening to it, doing nothing. I felt like empty handed, but I just wanted to hear the rest of it. But it's a beautiful book, and it's about systemic racism and a lot of the issues that have come to the surface this year in particular. So the timing of that book, because I think it came out in March, was I mean, obviously these issues have been going on all along, but it came out right before, the Black Lives Matter movement gained a lot of momentum in June. But it's a terrifying book because it feels so real. But it's such an important book because I think we need to, the only way that we can cross boundaries and experience these lives that aren't ours and empathize with them is to live them through character, or at least for some people who struggle to empathize. If you put yourself in that's a way to humanize people, right? Like, now we get to know this character who is so authentic, and we love that person. And then when we see them struggle against all of these issues that come in headlines, but maybe feel a little sterile or unbelievable, but now we see it in practice, it's so much easier to understand, what people are enduring.
Yeah, I think that fiction writing and fiction reading, maybe reading in general, but there's something about reading about the world we live in through the eyes of a fictional character that is such an osmosis of empathy. You're putting yourself in the place of someone who isn't you, whose lived experiences aren't yours, who doesn't even exist except in imagination. But through that experience, you can inhabit their world, and it makes you a bigger person. It makes you a better person,
Years ago, I read this study, I think it was the New York Times that did it, that tracked brain waves while someone was reading fiction, and the brain operated the same as it does when that person is experiencing that exact thing. So
Really?
yes, so it's like the brain is experiencing story as if the brain is living that experience.
Oh, I have always felt that way. I mean, when I read fiction, I'm there. And it's such an intense experience. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
But then also, so you're right there and you're living it too, but having it be fiction also provides some sort of like a safety cushion too, like that, like it's a little different than reading something that happened in the news, like which maybe is too close, or people get too, like people who maybe are on opposing sides might get too defensive, to say like maybe that's inflammatory language, or having it be in story makes it a little bit more accessible, like the guard lowers a little bit, and you're like brought into it kind of carefully and with grace, and yeah, I mean, it's so important. And yeah, so this The Good Neighborhood was a very important book for this year.
Oh, I'm so interested to read it. I also did just read, this has been out quite a while, but Open City by, I don't know how to say his name,
Yeah, I don't know.
But it's Teju Cole, Open City. It's a slim novel, and it really is, it takes place almost entirely internally, as the main character of the novel, is walking around Manhattan, and the deep knowledge of that city. I'm a walker. I walk a huge amount, and I like to soak up a city through the soles of my feet. And that is what this novel is entirely. His encounters with the strangers he sees, his encounters with long lost people that he had lost track of, his internal thoughts. It's a quiet internal book, but I felt as though I was inhabiting this man's body and mind as I walked the streets in New York with him. It's a really interesting book.
Oh yeah, what it was called, Open City.
Open City by Teju Cole.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I used to go, because when we were living in Long Island at St. Joseph's College, I used to just take the train in and walk for hours up and down Manhattan. So yeah, that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. Um, so I have a question. Maybe this will be a wrap-up question. I'm not sure, but it's a question every writer gets. But honestly, I enjoy listening to the actual physical, literal process of how you write. Are you a morning person? Are you a yellow legal pad and pencil person? Are you how do you do it?
I definitely need to do it in the morning. So I'm very fortunate that my husband has always been so supportive of my writing, probably because I get very grumpy if I'm not writing. But even before I sold a book, he would make the time for it, and make sure that I'm making the time for it. So he's a college professor, so he luckily is able to schedule his classes in the afternoon, and I work all morning, and he watches my son, and then we swap. I'm at my laptop, coffee, it's like that association, I like, you have like the smell, and it's like the ceremony of it that kind of sinks you into the mindset. And then as far as like plotting and stuff goes, like I said, I've written a bunch of books. Some of them will never see the light of day, but with every different project, I try a different approach, because I think, man, the last one just didn't, like, that couldn't have been the fastest way. But it turns out that there is no fast way. I've tried. So that the book that's coming out in April, The Happiest Girl in the World, I tried planning out scene by scene what would happen, and then just writing it. But it turns out that I need to write one, maybe two drafts before I even, of like the full length, like 300 pages, before I even figure out what the story is actually about, and who the characters are, and what's driving them, and what the heart of it is. So then everything has to get redirected after I find that heart, or after a reader reveals that heart to me. Sometimes that happens, when that's the case for The Happiest Girl. Is I wrote, an entire draft or two, and then I send it to readers, and they're like, it's really about this friendship, right? And I was like, oh, well, that's too bad, because there's like 200 pages that are now useless. So yeah, that's my process. But yeah, sitting at the morning, we get up at 7, and by 7:30 I'm with my coffee at my desk, and I get about 4 hours at a time. I feel like if I have less than 2 hours, I'm like, what's the point? Which is just me finding an excuse to give up, which is what I'm searching for all the time. So I need no excuse. I need, like, okay, here's your 3 or 4 hour block. You've got to get some work done. What about you? What's your process?
I'm so easily distracted, kind of an unmedicated ADD type. So I get up, make my coffee because that one perfect cup is everything. And then I don't open any browsers. I set a timer for half an hour because I can manage half an hour, and then I just write, and then I set the timer again. And so I usually work for 1.5, 2 hours writing. It takes all my energy. By the end of that, I'm like, okay, let me do some laundry, let me vacuum or let me exercise, anything but that.
I
So
know you feel like your brain gets clenched, right? And then so like you have to do like laundry is like a release, like, okay, just like relax that muscle.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I need to block my browsers because I waste so much. I have such precious time in the morning. All I get is those little hours, and I waste so much of it. Just like sometimes I'll open 2 browsers and go to the same freaking social media site, and I'm like, yeah, there's another browser open. What am I doing?
I think that's the age we live in.
Yeah.
It's addictive, it's like a drug. And uh, I have to just shut it down. I have to go sober for half the day.
Do you use an app that blocks those websites, or how do you keep your browsers closed?
I close them before I go to sleep at night. And so when I wake up, there's no temptation. Well, I mean, there is temptation. I could
Right.
open,
But you just make a rule for yourself.
yeah, because I feel so much happier if I get my writing done
Yeah.
without distraction. It just gets the day off on such a better foot that it's actually like a reward in and of itself,
Right. Right. It's like pulling a slot machine. And I'm like, okay, what else is going to come up? And it's like a little endorphin release. And it's so easy to get that little surge.
Yeah.
Whereas writing is so hard.
Writing is so hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to try to adopt some of that self-discipline because I think I'd feel much better if I'm not sure what these sites really offer me.
I know. Totally agree. I'm right there with you. So,
Yeah.
yep. Let's do it in the morning and know each other is doing it. And that'll be moral support.
Thank you. Yes. We're in on it together.
I like that, an unseen support group.
Yeah.
So nobody has any questions? I'm amazed. Come on, somebody's got to have a question out there. All right. Well, this was a great discussion.
Yeah, I enjoyed
Really,
it.
it was so interesting. And there are a lot of similarities in your book, so it really worked very well.
It was a small amount of magic there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Really incredible. So
Well, I really, sorry.
Everyone in the room, I'm just going to tell you a little secret. Belmont Books is one of the greatest bookstores. I love them. I go online and order books from them, even though I live in Minneapolis. So I try to, divide my book buying, which is totally out of control and always is, between my neighborhood indie, which is Majors and Quinn, Belmont Books, and then Laguna Beach Books in California. So I'm kind of like tri-coastally ordering books from my favorite bookstores. But I don't think you can go wrong with ordering Mercy House from Belmont. So that's my little plug.
They have a
Thank you,
10%
Allison.
off. You have a 10% off deal going on, right? Until Thanksgiving for 3 or more
We-
books?
Exactly. Thank you for plugging that.
Yep. And there's some, if you do buy Mercy House, they have signed book plates that they can stick in, and so you can have an autographed copy.
Just put that in the comments section that you would like one, and we'll be happy to get that out to you. And I want to thank you both so much. This was really fun. And I want to thank everybody who came. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that we'll see you at some of our other events as well.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye, everyone.
Our pleasure. Bye. Have a great night, everyone.
You too.